Angela let out a little gasp, and she blinked a couple of times as she stared down at the first sealed page. Now it was marked April 3, 2006. Angela glanced over at the clock, and its red numbers shouted the time to 23 a.m. into the darkness of the room. She shook her head, amazed yet again. Even if the page would have stated that date before she'd gone to bed, she wouldn't have been able to open it since it still had been April 2nd. But now she was allowed. The page itself permitted her, even beckoned her to break the seal. How does the book know what date to book? She wondered to herself. But then a smile found its way to her lips once more. It's almost like the Bible is alive and knows about the current events of the present. Is this the work of Diana or God, or both? For some reason beyond her knowledge, Angela felt summoned to stand beside the nightstand. Knowing better than to try and stifle such energy, she stood up. Once she was standing, she felt further guided to place the Bible on the nightstand while standing upright in front of it. From that position, she cracked the seal and unfolded the page from left to right, unveiling the image it contained. Angela had to do a double take. A swastika, she whispered, completely caught off guard. She knew that the swastika wasn't necessarily a Nazi symbol. She learned years ago that it had been used throughout history in many different places, including India, Asia, the Middle East, and even North America. But that knowledge didn't make her any less confused or any less scared. "Grandma, what are you trying to tell me?" After taking a deep breath, Angela allowed her mind to traverse the memories from her most recent experience. Caden and Eli, she remembered, seemed to have studied social Darwinism, like it was the answer to everything. Perhaps they, or at least Eli, thought that proved they were part of an elite trace of people, a master race, that had the responsibility of aiding evolution. That mindset sounded sickeningly familiar. If my gut feeling's correct, then this version of the swastika isn't a good one, she thought. But there's no point in guessing the image's meaning just yet. I'll find out soon enough. She glanced over at Nathan to make sure her actions hadn't wakened him. Unsurprisingly, he still was sound asleep. She was glad. Her husband sorely needed his rest. Still standing, Angela reached her hands forward and rubbed her fingertips over the image of the swastika. Instantly, before she could take another breath, she found her face an eighth of an inch above the page, even though she hadn't leaned down to get a closer look at it. She still could feel her body, but she felt as though she was stretched, not bent over. Thinking quickly, she glanced down to see if she could catch a glimpse of her waistline, but what she saw startled her. Her waist was transparent, allowing her to see straight through her body. Angela raised her eyes to look back up at the page, and that's when it happened. All she felt was her face moving forward, and then she was gliding into the page, like a ghost walking through a wall. The fleeting thought that she indeed was like a ghost, translucency and all, passed through her mind. Then, when she tried to turn her head to see what was happening, it spun 180 degrees, as though her genes somehow had been combined with Annelle's. Looking behind her, she watched as her body curved like a clear plastic tube that arched and swiveled. She could see the whole way back down to her feet, which remained pinned to the floor in front of the nightstand in her bedroom. Spinning her head back around so she again was facing forward, she found herself moving through what she only could describe as a wormhole. As she moved through the tunnel, she watched images of the world's history pass by. Recent news stories gave way to older ones, and it didn't take her long to realize that she was moving back in time. But she couldn't figure out if she simply was having an experience with the Bible, or actually was time traveling. Maybe, she thought, they're one and the same. After a little while of drifting, Angela glimpsed the end of the tunnel. Way down there, an image began to appear, and it grew closer and closer the farther through the wormhole she went. Wondering how far she'd come, Angela spun her head around 180 degrees once again. But then her whole body jolted, because she didn't see what she was expecting to see. Instead, two large eyes and a mouth slit came face to face with her. A voice hissed out from the mouth that didn't move. "Going somewhere, Angel?" "Legion." Angela screamed. "Yes." His voice was as calm and snake-like as usual. "I am everywhere, if you haven't noticed." "What do you want from me?" she shot back. "What do I want from you?" he asked, still coy. But then his voice turned darker, more threatening. "I want you out of my playpen." Angela firmly shook her head. "Never. I have a job to do." don't ruffle my feathers." She didn't know where the words came from, but they made her smile, because they reminded her of the strength in her wings. And with that, Angela spun her head forward to face the image that was gaining clarity by the second. She could tell that the people in the image looked like soldiers, but antiquated ones. From World War II, maybe, she thought. And what she saw next only cemented that notion. She shook her head in horror as her eyes landed on the swastika patches that were stitched onto the soldiers' shoulders. Angela was in the scene now, almost without realizing it. And as she moved closer to the men who were gathered together, she could make out some of the words they were saying, all of which involved rockets and space travel, even though she intrinsically realized they were speaking German. This doesn't make any sense, she thought, scrunching her eyebrows. None of that happened until the 60s. Searching for answers, or at least for something to alleviate her confusion, Angela glanced around until her eyes locked onto a man who looked entirely out of place. He appeared to be part Asian, part Caucasian, and his hair was so blonde that it almost looked white. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing a uniform, and his clothing was significantly more modern. And, to Angela's utter surprise, he was holding what looked like a cell phone up to his ear. No way could that be a cell phone, all the way back in the 40s. There has to be some kind of explanation for this. Just then, the man pulled out the cusp of his finely pressed sleeve to look at his watch. There was no mistaking its design. It was a modern Rolex that, like the cell phone, didn't match the time period whatsoever. But the watch wasn't what made Angela's eyes widen. Beneath it, on his wrist, was a dragonfly tattoo. As Angela continued to study the man, unsure of what to think, he looked right at her, seeming to know that she was there. She wanted to reel back, but she forced herself to hold his gaze, despite the sense of invasiveness it sent down her spine. And while he was staring straight into her eyes, he said, "Muhammad, I've got to go," ended the call, and held his cell phone down by his side. He turned away from Angela, then, and looked at the other men who were gathered there in what appeared to be an old-fashioned office building. "The plans are in place," he told them. "The crafts will flawlessly achieve anti-gravity if you make them adhere to the specs I gave you." With that said, he looked toward Angela once again, smiled, pulled up his sleeve, and pushed a button on his watch. Before she could do anything, or even think anything, he vanished, all at once, in a flash of bluish-white light. The other men stood with their right arms stretched straight out and their hands stiffened, saluting the vanished man. "Heil Kim," they said in stern unison. Angela tiptoed even closer to the group, and, as she did so, she caught a glimpse of an SS symbol stitched onto one man's collar. Oh my gosh. To Angela, there was no questioning it now. These men were real, original Nazis, and high-ranking ones, whether she wanted to believe it or not. And they were friends with Dr. Kim. Who knew an alien could help us so much? One of the men said, after the saluting was done. They thought Kim was an alien. Angela shook her head, shocked. Another man smiled. With extraterrestrials on our side, we must be doing what's right. Just then, Angela felt the urge to spin her head 180 degrees, to face her long, stretched-out body again. Even from this far away, she still could see her feet back on her bedroom floor, at the end of the long transparent tube. And at that instant, without a chance to stop, she found herself recoiling backwards through the tunnel. As she moved back towards her life, she glimpsed a familiar set of eyes in the images of the past. Legion, always at his dirty work, she thought. Then, in another moment, she was standing in her bedroom, right in front of her nightstand, as if nothing had ever happened.